Jacksonian America Part 2. We continue on with our discussion of American history during the age of Jackson. That would be President Andrew Jackson, first elected in 1828. He will serve 2 terms and cast a very large shadow over the entire era, really, that reaches well into the antebellum period just before the Civil War. By the 1830s, Americans celebrated the age of the common man, as we discussed in the last lecture. This was to be the time in which the individual rises secure in his independence. According to Ralph Waldo Emerson, it becomes him to feel all confidence in himself and to defer never to the popular cry. He and only he knows the world. Andrew Jackson promised to be the man of the people and to defend the nation against the manipulations of the privileged and financial elites. So he was both the hero of the common man and a great exemplar of the individual, the man who rose from poverty and backwoods rusticity to the very heights of power, self-made rather than spoiled. No silver spoon for Andrew Jackson. He was a man who, at least in the common parlance, did it on his own. Jackson symbolized the individual in the age of the common man who embodied the virtues of democracy. Democracy implying here the rough equality, at least the perceived equality of those who worked with their hands, those who farmed the fields or labored in the workshops. The rough equality of those common people with the wealthy who were to be suspected, I think, in Jackson's day of some nefarious scheme perhaps to steal that common element from American democratic society. Even though Jackson himself had, of course, become quite wealthy, nevertheless, he was different because he was from the ranks of the common people. At least that was the political spin put on the significance of Jackson's life. By the 1830s, democracy had become a central element of American culture. A famous French visitor, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, the great sweeping commentary on America in the age of Jackson, authored in 1835, visited America during this time to understand the democratic revolution taking place in the United States. The Frenchman Tocqueville observed, "The very essence of democratic government consists in the absolute sovereignty of the majority, and the power of the majority in America is not only preponderant, but irresistible." American democracy emphasized individual ingenuity, a sense of equality, and a public sphere that encouraged widespread participation of the common people. But did democracy guarantee good government or virtuous action? Recall that a generation of American leaders had feared that democracy was too ill-disciplined, that the common man was too used to responsible governing, and thus too much democracy was almost as bad as too little. De Tocqueville worried about what he called, for example, the tyranny of the majority. "I know of no country in which there is so little independence of mind as in America," he wrote. "In America, the majority raises formidable barriers around the liberty of opinion. Within these barriers, an author may write what he pleases, but woe to him if he goes beyond them. His political career is closed forever, since he has offended the only authority which is able to open it." Jackson's critics, in fact, claimed that his motto should be, "To the victor belongs the spoils." Rejecting his claim of interest in the common man, they said he was simply a opportunistic politician out to make more for his followers than to defend the interests of the common man. Fearing that he could not trust the government workers appointed by his Republican predecessors, it's true that Jackson introduced the principle of rotation in office for federal officials. The Jacksonian policy of distributing government jobs to loyal Democratic Party members became known as the spoils system and was a chief target of criticism for Jackson's rivals. For the Jacksonians, it was simply a way of guaranteeing the Democratic Party's full influence in government, and thus, in the name of the common man, proceeded to introduce this habit of using government power to distribute government offices and other opportunities to those who were loyal to the party. Democracy did not extend to all in the age of Jackson, as indicated by his plan for Indian removal. In other words, what you realize pretty quickly about the age of Jackson is that the claims of Jacksonian democracy did not extend to those outside the scope of white America. Jackson's policy regarding Indians, for example, was famously to remove them east, from the east to the west, from their traditional homes to the areas beyond the Mississippi River, either by persuasion or by force. From his famous Indian removal address, Jackson said, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion." The contrast was clear, at least in Jackson's mind, between the former and the latter, and there was no question that his plan to remove the Indian peoples of the Southeast, of the Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi region, the so-called civilized tribes, because many of them had conferred with whites and had conformed to Anglo standards, the so-called 5 civilized tribes would nevertheless be swept aside by the Jacksonian steamroller of democracy. And you can see here how a critic of Jackson's, remember Jackson inspired great adoration and loyalty and support, but also great criticism. And a critic of Jackson here shows him as a kind of arrogant puppet master, really, who has reduced the native people to puppet status and has collected them much like dolls for his particular vision of a republic constituted by whites. Jackson's policy regarding Indian removal showed the limits of Jacksonian democracy. Secretary of War John Eaton said, "The President views the Indians as the children of the government. He sees what is best for them, and that a perseverance in their refusal to fly the dangers that surround them must result in their misery and final destruction." So Jackson was able, in a paternal sense, to claim that what he was doing for the native people was in their own interests. After all, their removal would free them from the danger of the surrounding whites who coveted their land and who despised them and resented their presence. What wasn't so clear, of course, that antagonism was fueled by Washington, and that Jackson's own stand on the inequality of Indians only further emboldened those who wished to have them removed. Despite the efforts of some tribes to become civilized, as I said before. By 1830, the Cherokees had attempted to adopt many elements of white American society, such as the creation of a formal government with a bicameral legislature, a court system, and a written constitution modeled on the U.S. Constitution. Cherokee member Sequoyah invented an 86-character alphabet that made it possible to transcribe the language. The Cherokees published a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, written in English, using as well as in their alphabet, using the script created by Sequoyah, who you see here. Nevertheless, despite their conformity, they faced repeated battles with the state of Georgia, for example, where much of the Cherokee Nation was located, and clung tenaciously, heroically even, to their autonomy, exercising all the means at their disposal. In a famous court case, Supreme Court case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, from 1831, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Indian tribes did not have the right to appeal to the Supreme Court. But in the 1832 case the following year, Worcester versus Georgia, concerning the arrest of two missionaries living among the Cherokee, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia had no right to rule in Cherokee territory, so a strange limbo. The Court of the United States claiming that the Cherokee could not appeal to the white man's court, and yet at the same time claiming that the state of Georgia, the white man's government, had no right to rule in Cherokee territory, so a strange standoff. This latter case had been brought by the circumstances arising from a white missionary, Samuel Austin Worcester, who had been arrested and imprisoned when helping the Cherokee people, fight a series of discriminatory laws in Georgia. This Worcester versus Georgia made it to the Supreme Court and seemed to win a decision at least prohibiting white government, such as the government of Georgia, from interfering in the affairs of the Cherokee Nation. Now, famously, or infamously, President Jackson's response to all of this pretty much sealed the fate of the Cherokee and the other tribes, and certainly went a long way toward dividing even the Cherokee amongst themselves. The victory the Cherokee felt following Worcester v. Georgia faded quickly. When Jackson heard the verdict, he responded, quote, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Marshall, of course, was the Supreme Court justice who had helped write the majority opinion in Worcester v. Georgia. In other words, Jackson proved totally unwilling to enforce the decision of the court, had no intention of preventing Georgia from interfering in the affairs of the Cherokee Nation. In fact, would do everything it could to assist Georgia and the other states in getting the native people removed. This map shows the outcome of Jackson's Indian policy. Between 1830 and 1838, all the civilized tribes, except for the Seminoles of Florida, at least temporarily, but eventually them as well, that all the tribes would be forced west of the Mississippi River, that is, from their native homes and their native nations west to the Mississippi River, to a land known then as the Indian Territory, a land that was regarded by most whites as having relatively little value. As Cherokee leaders continued to protest government action, removal continued. Among the protest petitions sent from the Cherokee Nation to the U.S. Congress, for example, this one from 1836, which proclaimed that, quote, "For the purpose of showing what glaring oppressions and suffering the peaceful and unoffending Cherokees have been doomed to witness and endure, their devoted attachment to their native country has not been nor can ever be eradicated from their breast. So that even as they were being forcibly removed under escort of the U.S. Army across the dreary, snow-covered lands of the South toward their ultimate destination in the Indian Territory, even then, leaders among them continued to protest, continued to appeal, and petition the government, all in utter futility. And the resulting removal of the remaining tribes was remembered in history, of course, as the Trail of Tears. An estimated 18,000 men, women, and children were removed from their homes and led on a forced march from 1838 to 1839 to the Indian Territory in the West. Nearly a fourth of the Cherokee died of causes along the trail, causes ranging from exposure to lack of adequate nutrition and disease. And similar tactics of pressure and manipulation led to the removal of thousands of other Indians. From 1835 to 1842, as I said, the Seminoles of Florida adopted a policy of military resistance, but would then themselves be defeated and, like the others, removed. Osceola, the Seminole leader in Florida, led resistance to U.S. troops for years before he was captured in 1837. Eventually, most of Osceola's followers agreed to move west, and the whole episode reinforced white America's racial definitions of manhood and democracy in the age of Jackson. Jackson's Indian policy was in line with a strict definition of racial and cultural nationalism by whites, though even as the Indian removal played out, a new crisis would threaten the fabric of the nation. On the other side of the political universe, in response to Southern concerns about rising tariffs, South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun argued that states had the right to refuse to recognize or enforce a federal law that violated a state primarily within its own boundaries. That is, violated a state's laws primarily within its own boundaries. An idea that came to be called nullification. This idea of nullification that Calhoun theorized essentially held that the United States of America was a voluntary compact of states wherein the original 13 colonies freely and voluntarily agreed to join in union. Because of that entrance, said Calhoun, there had always been the acknowledged right, at least implicit right, that a state could voluntarily remove itself from the Union should its fundamental interests and laws be threatened or contradicted by those of another state, or, more likely, the national government. The issue over nullification revealed a deeper and widening difference over the focus of political and legal authority in America. Let's listen to Calhoun here describe it. I consider the Tariff Act as the occasion rather than the real cause of the present unhappy state of things. He was referring here to a tariff passed by Congress which presumed to tax foreign goods coming into the United States. Carolinians like Calhoun felt this was injurious to their state's economy because much of what South Carolina generated was export, agricultural crop, cash crop for export to England. Were we to tax English goods, for example, with tariffs, it was likely the English would tax our exports, including Carolina's exports. The truth can no longer be disguised that the peculiar domestic institution of the southern states and the consequent direction which that and her soil and climate have given to her industry has placed them in regard to taxation and appropriation in opposition to the rest of the Union. And you have to think carefully about this when he says that the peculiar domestic institution of the southern states. What's he talking about? Peculiar domestic institution meant slavery. And so he's saying that slavery, an institution then really only reserved to the southern states, the states that relied on cash crop agriculture, had put them at odds with the rest of the nation, which saw its economic interests as protectionist, that is, in Henry Clay's American system, as protectionist, favoring American manufactories, American products, rather than relying upon imports. Imports could be taxed with a tariff, but as Calhoun suggested, this only created a hostile climate for Carolina's own export crops to Europe. If there be no protective power, he says, in the reserved rights of the states, they must be forced to rebel or submit to have paramount interests sacrificed, their domestic institutions subverted by colonization and other schemes, and themselves and children reduced to wretchedness. Here what he's saying, John C. Calhoun, is that states will have to resort, states like Calhoun's own South Carolina will have to resort to a kind of rebellion to protect its own interests, its own institutions, against those of the larger North and the federal government. When he refers here to colonization and other schemes, he's referring to early efforts to deal with the threat of a biracial society. That is, among those who were worried that America could never exist, white and black, but would have to somehow purge its black residents. In this case, the colonization scheme suggested by repatriating them to Africa, the land of their forebears, and a special colony established called Liberia in West Africa. Calhoun saw this as a direct threat of the institution of slavery, as a means of preparing for the ultimate extinction of slavery. Again, something he felt that states like South Carolina would have to take stern measures to protect. Basically, if you're following the drift here, what's happening is a kind of preview, a 30-year preview to what ultimately would rip the nation apart in the Civil War. Now, interestingly enough, Andrew Jackson's response to Calhoun's nullification idea was to assert federal authority. And I say interesting because, certainly with regard to the Indians, Jackson showed no sympathy. And one might suppose he would show no sympathy toward the interests of slaves. And he didn't. He was himself a slave owner, a man who himself held as human property slaves on his own Tennessee plantation. And yet Jackson opposed John C. Calhoun because the issues raised by nullification threatened his own commitment to the United States and nationalism. Though he was himself a Southerner and a slave owner, Jackson drew the line at the nullification crisis because he felt that it threatened the status of the Union. If states could nullify federal law, there would be no national authority. As he put it, that to give the right of resisting laws of that description, coupled with the uncontrolled right to decide what laws deserve that character, is to give the power of resisting all laws. Fellow citizens, the momentous case is before you. On your undivided support of your government depends the decision of the great question it involves, whether your sacred union will be preserved and the blessing it secures to us as one people shall be perpetuated. So an angry denunciation of Calhoun's nullification idea. And here you see in a cartoon Calhoun bowing before Jackson, asking for pardon, while Jackson says, "By the eternal, this union must and shall be preserved. A traitor's doom to him who acts against it." Much of this rhetoric, this division, this harsh feeling engendered by one section, the South, would be replayed, of course, decades later in the lead up to the Civil War. Just as the slave rebellion foreshadowed the coming conflicts of a democracy torn apart by its own contradictions. In 1831, black preacher Nat Turner led about 70 slaves in an uprising in Virginia, an uprising that slaughtered 55 whites. After the 4-day rebellion, angry whites captured and executed Turner and his followers. Virginia reimbursed the slaveholders for their slaves, but in the hysterical climate in the wake of the rebellion, known as Nat Turner's Rebellion, courts and legislatures enforced repressive policies on slaves and free blacks. Slaves as far away as North Carolina were accused of being connected with the revolt and were subsequently tried and executed. In most areas, slaves were forbidden from attending religious services, learning to read, writing, owning weapons, buying liquor, and holding public assemblies. The Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia sent a shockwave throughout the South and only quickened the resolve of Southerners, particularly slave-owning Southerners, to defend their peculiar institution at all costs. At the end of his life, Jackson caught a glimpse of what this fate beheld for a nation. News of a coming war with Mexico reached him at his plantation home in Tennessee just before his death. The Mexican War, in fact, from 1845 to 47, would be one of a number of conflicts that tore the fabric of union and democracy apart over the intertwined issues of expansion and slavery during the antebellum period. And in his last days, attested by the photograph taken of him just before his death in 1845, in his last days, Jackson understood that his cherished union was being torn asunder by the very issues that he had a part in fomenting, that of slavery, of plantation agriculture, just as he had sought and fought in his days as a military commander to preserve and build a union, a seemingly contradictory life, a life that itself would come to an end in the 1840s, just as the life of the United States threatened to. And what we'll now move to is the antebellum period, that is the period before the war, a period we know that will be rife with sectional division and growing hostility between sections north and south. So the age of Jackson gives way to the antebellum period, and the man himself remains a symbol of the complicated legacy of American democracy.